The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Stoa. Today we're visited by Alexander Beiner, one of the founders of Rebel Wisdom. Our good friends at Rebel Wisdom. We're always happy that when they're here, they're actually having another session on Friday on Clubhouse, so that should be cool. And I was talking to Ali on WhatsApp. We're trading voice messages. Like, okay, you gotta do some of that stuff. What should we do? And psychedelic sense making. That coinage, it just like tickled me in the right way, and it had the right amount of sexiness too. And the intersection of psychedelics and sense making is a topic that I don't think is discussed that much. So I'm quite happy to have this discussion here at the Stoa, and I think Ali was at Clubhouse recently too, having a discussion on it, and he was on various other podcasts. So that's going to be the theme of today, and I'm going to take an Ali in a moment. He's going to share some of his thoughts on some slides for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to pivot to Q&A. So if you haven't been here before at the Stoa, just drop your questions in the chat anytime. I'll call on you, unmute yourself. You can ask your question to Ali. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, just indicate that, and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Ali, welcome back to the Stoa.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this because this is one of the first times I've laid out psychedelic sense making as a concept, and because it's still developing as a concept, I'm really excited to get a bit of feedback and insight from everyone here, because I think, so like Peter just mentioned, I did a session on this in Clubhouse a few days ago. With the intention of prepping for this session, and that session alone, I left that with a bunch of notes, put them together, and I actually have some slides to go through this time. I haven't done a talk with slides in a while, but I actually have to give a shout out to Evan McMullen, who I saw was here for his excellent talk recently, which involved slides. And I thought, man, that is a good way to do things. I'm going to go back to that. So we're going to slide it up, and then, yeah, like Peter said, do about half an hour laying out what psychedelic sense making is or could be, let's say, and looking at some of the science of psychedelics and some of the phenomenology, and applying it to how we actually make sense of the world. Because I think, and the more I've delved into this, and the more it's been developing, the more I've actually started to realize these are two worlds that need to bridge. There's the sense making world, which the Stoa is part of. Rebel Wisdom, we've been focused on that a lot. There's a lot of people trying to make sense of what's going on. And at the same time, I have another life and wear another hat of being in the psychedelic world. And it hadn't really occurred to me to combine these two things, but I think they really should be combined. And the intention of this session is to kind of sell you guys on why I think that is. And so I'm curious to see if I can manage to do that. So I'm going to share screen. I'm going to share some slides, in fact. Let's just open that up. Cool. So yeah, like I just mentioned, psychedelic sense making is really a combination of the tools that the techniques and tools we use to navigate the psychedelic experience. And I think they are becoming increasingly necessary to make sense of the world we live in. So what I want to do is lay out what are those skills. What are the emotional, cognitive, and let's say psycho-spiritual capacities that have been used for thousands of years in the psychedelic experience and are now being used in psychedelic therapy and shamanic ceremonies around the world to help people go through what is a very intense and really earth-shattering experience that can completely flip our conception of reality. And well, so, and why does this matter right now? Well, because we're living in a hyper-salient information ecology. This is something we've covered on Rebel Wisdom a lot. Thinkers like Daniel Schmachtenberger have pointed out how the information landscape is increasingly captured by different forces, market forces. There's a proliferation of bullshit and untruths and half-truths. And so to actually figure out what's going on and to actually discern what is good signal, what is good information from poor information, we have to skill up because we're not used to, and we're arguably not evolutionarily designed to be able to make sense of this amount of information and this amount of contradictory information. So there's one issue. The other issue is that there's a wider trend, which I know a lot of people have talked about in the Stoa. Certainly we've covered a lot since the beginning of Rebel Wisdom, of living in a post-truth world, living in a hyper relativistic world in which many things are seen as socially constructed by some tribes and essentialist by other tribes. And we're trying to figure out what is the nature of truth. We're having a battle over what is the nature of truth, and actually what is the nature of trust. How do we discern? How do we trust? And the psychedelic experience itself is hyper relativistic. And so it's not such a leap to be used to that space, to be used to that state, and then go into, say, delving into the internet and trying to make sense of something by reading 25 articles and looking at a Facebook feed and looking at a Twitter feed and hearing counterpoints, and also having this almost overwhelming proliferation of multiple narratives that really defines the postmodern experience and the postmodern world we're in. And then the third thing is what I've called the age of breach. So what I and I know others have perceived as a kind of a reemergence of the religious and symbolic and archetypal into culture. Not that it was, in fact, it was there the whole time, but this kind of eruption of new forms of religion and symbolic meaning that have been brewing online, which is really a kind of mechanical unconscious, this place where all of our hopes, dreams, desires, shadows go kind of meld together and express themselves aesthetically, express themselves through memes, through images, and then now increasingly erupt into consensus reality. So we saw that eruption after the death of George Floyd. We saw an eruption of a particular worldview, really into HR departments all around the world, into the media. We saw the eruption in a completely different way with the riots at the Capitol buildings, at the Capitol building rather, and the kind of QAnon religion that was brewing online and then erupting out. So these are completely different they're different cultural phenomena, but I think they have the same genesis in that there is a kind of imaginal liminal world that we're all sharing and all putting information into, and increasingly that world is bleeding into ours. And that's another really common and very, well, let's say normal part of the psychedelic experience and psychedelic literature and psychedelic art, this sense of two worlds blending together. So in order to navigate that, as individuals just in the world trying to make sense of culture, we have to use a lot of the same skills that we use in a psychedelic experience. And in a psychedelic experience, to navigate it skillfully, we're often sort of walking on a tightrope of having the right level of presence and fluidity. So it really is a flow state. And it's a fine line very often, and a fine balancing point, because if we tip over into meaning making, for example, or we tip over into freaking out and getting really, really scared, we are falling into a really dangerous place with psychedelics. We're falling into a place where the result could be a very difficult experience until we kind of manage to grab ourselves and process it with some of the tools I'm going to be talking about in a moment, or in some cases, permanent insanity. You know, it's really serious stuff. And that's why I always encourage people to take psychedelics in a responsible and healthy way, because they're not all, and we're seeing the rise of kind of psychedelic medicine and psychedelic capitalism coming into the culture, psychedelic wellness, which is a term I hate, like this kind of like idea of making like kind of well-being with psychedelics. These are tools and substances that teach us how to die before we die, and they can completely transform our world. And we play with them. We can play with them certainly, but we lose our respect for them at our peril. And so, but of course, from that, from walking that tightrope, we also gain wisdom and knowledge if we use it in the right way. And I think the ancient shamanic traditions and actually what's coming out of clinical research is building this this combination of an old and a new wisdom tradition of how to navigate altered states. And in many ways, we're sort of living in a cultural altered state. So I wanted to talk about something that's a really common refrain in psychedelics, and really key for navigating the experience, which is set, setting, and dose. There's also another word which comes from a researcher called Betty Eisner, who worked a lot with LSD in the 1950s and beyond, who's kind of been forgotten a little bit from the history books, but she talked about matrix as well. Matrix is the world you come back to after you leave that altered state, the kind of web of connections. And then that, of course, extends outward over and over. So you have your own family web, you might have a web of other people who've had the experience, a kind of sangha. And then beyond that, you have the society you're returning to, the context, the kind of the environment you're in. And that's really key. So set, you could apply to making sense of culture normally as just, let's talk about, for example, our complexity tolerance, our ability to tolerate complexity and different contradictory ideas and challenge. So that has a big effect on how we navigate psychedelics and also how we're navigating the world. If we cannot handle being challenged, if we cannot handle, heightened complexity and heightened intensity, then we often collapse into some kind of trauma response. So we get really hyperactivated and fighty, or we shut down and get into kind of a frozen state. And then setting is very, very important in the psychedelic experience. Where we are has a huge effect on what we experience. And I know people like Nora Bateson, for example, have been on the Stoa a lot as well, and I really admire her work. She looks specifically at how information changes across contexts, and the psychedelic experience highlights that very intensely. The context you're in changes what's happening, changes how you're making sense of it. It just does it much more intensely under psychedelics. Stanislav Grof is another famous psychedelic researcher. He talked about them as non-specific amplifiers. So whatever's there, whatever you're feeling, whatever you're sensing, it gets dialed up massively, and you feel it very, very intensely. So, and then dose is more specific to the drug experience, less so, I think, to applying it to general sense making. It's how much you've taken. And then matrix, I've already talked about, the kind of the wider system in which things are taking place. So I'm going to move on now to what are some of the capacities that the psychedelic experience brings us that we can apply, or should apply perhaps, to sense making in general. And one of them, which is really, really key, is cognitive flexibility. So cognitive flexibility is something that John Vervaeke talks about a lot, and talks about specifically in the context of the kind of practices that we do it, on the Stoa, on Rebel Wisdom, dialogos practices that help us break our frames, mindfulness, Tai Chi, all the practices that help us zoom out of our experience and look at our frames, and then zoom in and use our frames. So this back and forth is really key. And cognitive flexibility is also associated with depression, for example. People with depression have very low cognitive flexibility. It's really hard to think outside of the box you're in. Everything goes into what Vervaeke calls a reciprocal narrowing. So it's like less and less frame of reference. It's harder and harder to see things differently and get out. And the culture wars, I think, can be looked at through a frame of cognitive flexibility. Like there is a radical kind of lack of acceptance of different frames when we're in a place of ideological fixation. And what the psychedelic experience does is pulls us right out of that, albeit temporarily, and allows us to see our frames from a much further vantage point. And in fact, my wife, actually, Murphy Beiner, did the first study of cognitive flexibility in the afterglow period of ayahuasca. And it showed that there is a statistically significant increase in your cognitive flexibility after the ayahuasca experience, as well as your levels of mindfulness. So there's this thing called the afterglow in psychedelics, which is the kind of 2 to 4 week, slightly longer perhaps sometimes, period after the experience where you have probably a higher level of neuroplasticity, so your brain can make new connections, and it's a really good time to intervene therapeutically. And cognitive flexibility is being increasingly looked at in psychedelic research, and it's again it is really what we're trying to do in many ways with the different practices that we're experimenting with, and the different wisdom traditions help us with cognitive flexibility. And without cognitive flexibility, we are stuck in our frames. And so being able to break free from our frames and find new frames, that's the way to steal the culture, in my view. It's to be able to find new frames and apply those frames. And psychedelics do it in a very powerful way. So the other capacity, or another capacity I want to talk about, is being able to discern the difference between salience and relevance. And this is, again, something I've learned a lot from John Vervaeke's work, and he's done amazing work around this, the cognitive science of relevance, realization, and salience. Psychedelics activate the salience network in our brains. So salience is what's standing out to you in your environment. And anyone who's had a psychedelic experience knows that that is a major part of the experience. What Aldous Huxley called the reducing valve of our consciousness is opened up. So our normal everyday waking consciousness is much more of a filtering out mechanism than anything else. Well, I wouldn't say that anything else, obviously it's far more complex, but it filters stuff out. And when we take a psychedelic, everything is far more salient. But salient doesn't always mean relevant. Like if I'm trying to discern the different arguments around climate change, and I'm trying to really make sense of climate change, and I'm trying to hold multiple perspectives, I'm trying to do my own research, I'm trying to navigate like a huge amount of different information, I need to know what of all of that salient information which is shouting out at me, what's relevant to my inquiry. And if I can't do that, I'm just going to be completely lost. And so it's similar with the psychedelic experience. If I go in, I need to be able to navigate it in a certain way where I can be comfortable with the fact that everything is really, really salient, but I'm also able to kind of feel into what's relevant for me. And that it's an all body, all kind of full cognition approach, which also requires an intuition. And just a quick example of how that actually looks for me, at least in a psychedelic experience. I was walking in the woods one time on mushrooms because we'd gone camping, and we were walking, just having a nice stroll in the forest. And it was quite a nice day, so there were a lot of people out, and there was also an air show nearby. And so every now and again, I hear these old like Spitfires, etc., like zooming like above us. And as we were walking, I started to feel really, really uncomfortable and quite anxious. And I started inquiring, okay, well, what is it? What's going on? And this is a capacity called decentering, which is really useful, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, just to take a step back from the experience, say, okay, I'm having an experience of anxiety. What's salient around me right now? Okay, I'm walking, there's people walking on the path, there's trees. Am I hungry? No, I'm not really sure. And then again, I hear the plane go by, like, so okay, I think that's the thing that's making me feel anxious. Well, what is it about the plane? Why is the plane so salient to me right now? Okay, started thinking about it and feeling into it, and then realized that the plane represented something. There was a frame attached, there were like lots of links attached to that, and the plane represented culture. The plane represented mainstream culture. It was the kind of the military-industrial complex. It was the nation state. And I thought, okay, well, is that freaking me out? Is that no, it wasn't quite that. And so through a process of inquiry, it turned out that the plane actually, the representation of culture linked to feeling uncomfortable tripping around different people, and so there was this process of inquiry going on, and that then led me to a much deeper insight down the road. But the reason I lay out that process is because there's a sort of salience mapping that goes on in the psychedelic experience that we can use when we're making sense of other things, and let's take that climate change example. If I'm looking through research, I go, okay, bam, bam, bam. Hey, that keeps calling out to me. Okay, so I need to at the same time be discerning and be like, okay, maybe I'm going down like a wrong cognitive path, but that data set or that person's idea seems really important. And if I can kind of move with that, I can start making sense in a way that is beyond just the propositional knowing. It becomes a participatory knowing. I'm like fully engaged with it. So I wanted to then move on to one of the final capacities I want to talk about before we move on to skills. And this is a capacity of being able to go in and through. In and through is a phrase that is often given to people going through a psychedelic experience. And it is this process of radically accepting what's coming up. You know, it's like, you know, even if it's something like, I'm feeling super paranoid right now, and I think you guys are all monsters, and I need to get out of here. It's like, yes, go into that. Go fully into that. Never try and resist. When you try and resist in a psychedelic experience, it's the same as if you try and resist a thought or a feeling in life, except amplified. It becomes very difficult and even worse. So if you can fully go into it, then you unlock a kind of something new. And I think this attitude, this is an attitudinal capacity that I think we need for sense making. This is an attitude of radical acceptance, which I touched on before. So radical acceptance of, yes, this is, not this has meaning, but this is happening. This is a real thing I'm experiencing. So that could be something happening in the culture. Like, let's take the Capitol riots. You know, you could have a reaction to that of like, oh my God, this can't be happening. This is too much. Or you could be like, wow, this is really out there. This is really intense. This has huge implications. I got to be with it and ride it and feel everything that's coming up. And I have to be able to stay centered and discern and try and navigate something incredibly weird and potent. And again, the opposite of this is a sort of radical denial and a radical narrowing that you get, again, in ideology and ideological fixation. You know, it's one of the reasons Terence McKenna said ideology is not your friend. It's someone else's frame overlaid onto you. And there's something about the psychedelic experience that really heightens our sovereignty if we're using it correctly. So the last thing I want to talk about, this last capacity, is decentering. Decentering is one of the 5 facets of mindfulness. And decentering is this ability that we have to step back from the content of our experience and observe it without reacting to it. So that, you know, it's anyone who's meditated or practiced mindfulness will be familiar with this. It's being aware from a place of stillness and from a kind of a different part of your conscious awareness of the content of your experience, and you don't get caught up in the content. And that is really key. It's not being like frozen and still and being what in Zen is sometimes called a stone Buddha, where you're like really like, no, I'm not reacting to that. I'm not reacting to that. It's being with it, but not getting caught in it, not trying to negotiate with reality, to try and make it something that you want it to be, to try and make it different. It's about accepting it, paying attention to it, being fully with it. John Kabat-Zinn, who instrumental in bringing mindfulness to the West in its current iteration, at least, calls it laying out the welcome mat to whatever thoughts, feelings are there. And the ability to decenter, I increasingly think, is one of the most important skills, capacities in the psychedelic experience. And it is one of the most important capacities we can have when we're trying to make sense of culture. And when we're trying to expand our awareness, because if you're this close to everything and is that close to your identity, and you're talking about a really difficult issue, you're going to get lost in it. Or certainly every time I've tried that, being that close to it, I get lost in it. And that's what I've seen happening to other people. It's only by taking a step back and not taking it so personally, is another way to talk about decentering, that I can say, that's very interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. And there's a link between decentering and offense. Like when you're, you know, when everyone is kind of hyper offended by everything, it is very different. It's kind of the opposite of decentering. I've noticed that when I'm meditating more than usual, I tend to take things less personally. And I went through a period of some weeks where I took nothing personally, and it was glorious. I was always trying to get back to that mode. It's kind of like my benchmark of how I'd like to be. Like nothing got under my skin, nothing got to me. I wasn't denying anything, but it was just like, yeah, okay, cool. 3 weeks in 34 years, but I'm going to try and make it 4 weeks soon. It's basically such an important skill, and we can practice it with mindfulness, and we can practice it through journaling and different techniques like that as well. So there's this isn't really a capacity, but this is something that happens and is really core to the psychedelic experience, which I'm calling escape the matrix, which is basically, this is the Gnostic initiation. This is having an experience where you realize that reality is more than it appeared, and that while it's not entirely constructed by us and society and language, much of it is constructed and much of it is fluid, and it is not as fixed and solid as it seemed to be. And this is really key because there's a capacity that develops around this of not taking things too seriously, not falling into nihilism though, and also not falling into a kind of a narcissism of I see everything, I know how everything connects. It's this sweet spot of holding things lightly that comes through a process of having a radically different perception on reality suddenly hoisted on you. And for many, they describe it as a kind of before and after experience of that. And so this escape the matrix awareness is something that also people talk about sometimes in the clinical trials, but certainly anecdotally, of like, no matter how bad or confusing or complex things get, I always just have some memory of this deep sense of unity and oneness and connection to a deeper reality. And that connection to deeper reality is an incredibly powerful emotional and cognitive anchor that can help us navigate chaos. So I wanted to just spend another 5 minutes on this and finish with some skills that I have found useful personally that come from the psychedelic experience, or certainly navigating it, and that I've personally found useful for sense making. So the first one is grounding. So the 4 skills, by the way, are grounding, holding, flipping, and blending. So starting with grounding is about it's similar to decentering. We're able to just connect ourselves really through the body, having an anchor. You know, what I just talked about is having that kind of cognitive anchor to a certain experience. There are also somatic anchors. So coming into our bodies in the face of complexity, and understanding as well that making sense isn't something we do with our heads. It's an entire body experience. And we know from cognitive science that our cognition isn't sort of happening here and then like telling our fingers to move. We're making sense as a full embodied animal. And so grounding is something that helps us in the psychedelic experience, because we can come into our bodies as an anchor. We can come back to our breath. We can center ourselves. And again, to use a Vervaeke term, we can remember that we're an agent in our environment, so we don't feel like alienated from it, but we can start to come back into this participation with it and be like, okay, I'm here, this is going on. That's a skill I think is incredibly useful for sense making in general, because it keeps perspective, and it keeps us from freaking out, and it helps us maintain our nervous system. Then there's holding, and holding is basically holding on when things get weird. It's as simple as that. You know, very often in a psychedelic experience, things are overwhelming. You know, we had Peter Levine in our wisdom gym a few months ago, who, you know, was really instrumental in the practice of somatic experiencing, and then, you know, kind of created that, understanding how trauma moves through the body and gets trapped in the body. And he talked about the psychedelic, you know, he was positive about psychedelics, but he also pointed out that they are basically what trauma is: too much, too fast, you can't get away. You know, so they are kind of very intense on the body, and so are the cultural shifts we're seeing. So is the age of breach. So is this absolute chaos we're going through as a culture, trying to find its soul. We have to be able to hold on, and we have to be able to ride the wave, as Terence McKenna used to put it. And so that's really, really key. And, you know, part of the way you do that in the psychedelic experience, or when someone's having a bad experience, like in a tent at a festival, this is what you would generally say is, this will end. This experience is going to end. So it's time contingent. I actually always write down on my hand when I started the experience, so that I can be like, okay, it was 10 a.m. and then I try and look at my watch or phone, and it's actually really difficult to see the numbers on there, but I will eventually be able to figure out, okay, the experience has been going on for 4 hours and it's going to end. So it's contextualized, and I'm able to just hold it. It's the same with cultural shifts, I think. They come and they go, and they're constantly changing. So there's this ability to stay with it as that happens. Flipping is one of my favorites. So one thing that psychedelics can really help us with is to be able to run multiple cultural operating systems at the same time. So we all have some sense of this, like we run a different operating system when we're like in an office than when we are in the Stoa, or when we're talking to our loved ones, or when we're shooting shit with our friends on a WhatsApp group, whatever. We're running different operating systems. We have different social contracts everywhere. Flipping is a little bit like that, but more intense. Flipping is about being able to flip between different worldviews fluidly and with skill. So for example, I found it like, being in Peru and sitting in Shipibo ayahuasca ceremonies, which is a radically different culture with a different ontology. I found it easier to just take that operating system temporarily and get into a very archaic, not necessarily that their model is just archaic, and there's a lot of complexity and fascinating kind of depth to it. More that I found it useful to get into a much more kind of place where I'm deep in my unconscious and I can run that operating system. And when the ceremony is over, I slowly I flip into a different operating system. And I'm like, okay, that operating system is not appropriate for walking down the street, but it was appropriate for there. And there's many different examples of that. There's different, like switching between operating systems, I think is crucial. And it's also related to cognitive flexibility. And then finally, blending. So blending, there's a kind of neurological correlate to blending in the psychedelic experience, what's actually happening in our brains. Psychedelics help different areas of our brain talk to each other, and they also reduce activity in the default mode network, which is a really major network that connects the front and back of your brain, and it's the seat of your narrating I, the ego that is having or thinks it's having the experience. And of course, when that disappears, you don't disappear. You are there aware, but things that were previously unconnected come together. They blend together. And that's where there's a huge amount of creativity in the experience, which is another thing we need for sense making. And I think we need more of in the sense making space is the link between creative knowing and sense making. It's actually something Greg Thomas and I have talked about quite a lot, using art and aesthetic as a different way of knowing and making sense. And blending is, so there's a blending that happens between different areas of our brain under psychedelics, but then there's a really important facet to blending, which is our ability to allow different contradictory worlds to blend together as we're trying to make sense of culture. Like we have to be able to do that. It doesn't work very well in the world right now to have different, really strictly defined boundaried boxes of like, this is this, and this is this, and this is only true here. Everything is fluid and contextual and blending together. So those are the skills I found useful. Those are the capacities. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I realized I kind of ran through that quite quickly, and there was a lot of information, but I wanted to keep to time and make sure we had time for questions. Or comments. So I'm curious to hear anything and everything.
Yeah, that was so good. I'm not, haven't done much psychedelics, but now I want to do them after seeing that PowerPoint. So start throwing your question in the chat, or if you have any statements you'd like to share, put that there as well. We'll take in Evan McMullen first.
So this is kind of a long one, for which I apologize, but I'll get it out. Scott recently wrote on Astro Codex 10 about theories of depression, which explain the phenomenology of depression as a sort of global downweighting of signal from our here and now sensory evidence in favor of a negatively valenced global prior. And then so when we speak of salience versus relevance, it seems to me that most people in our society, and even most of the sense-making scene, with respect to relevance, are depressed in this sense, which is to say they're overweighting some negative global priors over their direct in the moment sensory experience. And so I wonder if we integrate the psychedelic boost to direct sensory perception into our sense making, if we might end up de-emphasizing topics such as the meta crisis and re-emphasize the experience of our present moment existence as embodied creatures. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the probable changes in emphasis in the sense-making scene, assuming that the insights and experience of psychedelic states, drug-induced or otherwise, are integrated. How would our focus as a scene change in your view?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, there's a couple of possibilities. One thing that's really important to bring up is that it's debatable in the psychedelic world how much of the experience is determined by the narrative you have going into it and your setting. Some people think it's everything. Other people think like, you know, that it's actually the drug experience and is more important than no one really thinks it's more important, but it's debatable to the extent. So it would really depend on what stimulus and what narrative we were telling around it, right? So, but to your point around, you know, what came up for me is that it's, you know, to make it really a kind of very simplified version of what you're saying, like depression is being fixated on the past, anxiety is being fixated on the future. And so there is something around, I think you're right, like there is something around a kind of meta crisis that then becomes its own narrative, which has a kind of reciprocal narrowing to it. And there's not a lot of movement to it. You know, I think Jem Bendell, who created Deep Adaptation, is a great example of that. I'm not sure if anyone's read his original paper, but, you know, I really don't like him. Not as a person, I don't like his work. You know, the real example of cherry picking and kind of going through a midlife crisis while looking at climate data and then coming to certain conclusions and then getting fixated on that. And the Deep Adaptation Facebook group is one of the worst places on the internet. It's kind of like, it's kind of self-flagellating, awful place. I highly recommend you check it out. It's a lot of fun as well. So, but to come back to your point, like it could help us kind of completely reframe, come back to a direct felt experience, come back to the actual sense-making capacities that we gain when we come back to there, this embodied sort of creative, present way of being. I think it would likely do that without too much narrative interference, if that makes sense. Like psychedelics do just tend to do that. I'm of the school that, yes, context, narrative setting, really, really important, but the plants have their own spirit in my worldview. They have their own intentionality, teleology. My relationship to the mushroom experience is one of a student to a teacher, and my experiences are all Socratic. It's like I ask questions, I get answers. That's my experience of it. So I really do believe there's whatever the ontological status is of that, there is something, there's an intelligence. So yes, so I think it could do that, but I think it would help as well if we had a narrative of everyone taking themselves a little bit less seriously. I include myself in that, by the way. Like that we just kind of get a little bit of the kind of trickster archetype that so often comes up with the psychedelic experience, a little bit of chaos, a little bit of strangeness and weirdness and messiness. I think that would do wonders for our sense making. I'm keen to keep exploring what that might look like.
Any quick follow-up, Evan? No? Okay, cool. Let's take in Reed.
Hey, Ali, this is interesting. I'm actually enrolled in Sensemaking 101 right now, so this feels like a bonus session right now. I'm curious about, I recently read Sasha Sagan's book For Small Creatures Such as We. It's basically an exploration of all sorts of different rituals and stuff for all sorts of common things that all human groups go through, like puberty and stuff like that. And I guess I'm kind of curious about maybe any kind of novel or like creative new forms of psychedelic rituals that maybe you've considered. Because like McKenna gave us 5 grams in the dark. John Hopkins kind of nailed down the therapeutic kind of setting with the eye shades and the support network and stuff. I had this intuition about doing something I'm kind of calling a wilderness dose. I love backcountry camping, and I'm quite comfortable and experienced in the backcountry. And I've done a large dose in a kind of therapeutic setting before. And I'm kind of curious to like go somewhere where I feel comfortable, safe, in a tent, with nature, alone, because McKenna said culture's the third guest, even if you have a trip sitter. So I'm kind of curious to like really kind of be in nature. But thoughts on that if you have any, or thoughts on like any other sorts of like kind of creative and different ritualized contexts. Caveat emptor applies, obviously, not advice for anyone.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I mean, I just immediately thinking of friends I have who used to do ketamine ceremonies where they would wrap someone up in like layers of cellophane and give them high doses of ketamine and then cut them out and kind of have a rebirth experience. So there's one. But one that I'm more excited about doing is something I tried just before COVID. It was like maybe this time last year, maybe last January, which was just with one other person, and it was doing inquiry, which we do on Sensemaking 101, you know, as one of the main practices. And if anyone's not familiar with it, inquiry comes from the Ridwan tradition, diamond essence approach of A.H. Almas and Faisal. And it's a kind of talking meditation. It's not so different from circling, for example. It's just you tend to do it one-to-one rather than in a group, although there are group inquiries. So it's almost a talking meditation that allows you to be a kind of a connoisseur of your own experience and moving with, you know, the sensations of what you're feeling, concepts that come up, and kind of, you know, live sense making in a way, you could say. And I did inquiry while on psilocybin, and it was really, really profoundly deep. It was one of the deepest experiences I've ever had. And so I was basically, in a sense, I was inquiring into my experience as it was happening, and it just took me so deep because there was a kind of directionality to it, you know, that was, I don't think it would always work. I think sometimes the trip wants to move in a different way, and you've got to roll with that. But it was really powerful, and I would love to see what it looks like for inquiry and psychedelic healing to come together. I don't know if it would work as like psychedelic circling, because I feel like that could be quite overwhelming. It might work if people were quite experienced. But I know I have a friend who's done that. Actually, I have a friend who did it in a men's circle, which they called masochist roulette, where they were kind of like challenging each other on their shortcomings in a way, and like, you know, shadow reflections. I wouldn't recommend that to anyone, but he found it challenging, but ultimately, you know, quite useful. So there are things happening there, but psychedelic inquiry is something I'm really keen to explore, something new. Yeah.
Any quick follow-up, Reed?
No, thank you.
All right, Max, I'm going to take you in.
Hi, Alex. So to try to be speculative on what the future could be, perhaps 5 years down the line, now that it seems we have more clinical evidence, especially from the UK, that there is benefits to psychedelics in the treatment of mental health problems. How do you see it perhaps being implemented on a large scale? Or perhaps you have a window into some efforts because you run, because you're very connected to the subject, like into some politicians who are willing to have it being implemented on the NHS or on the what is the future of psychedelic therapy, basically? How do you see it being, and do you see like our culture adopting it at large scale, like perhaps grandmothers and older people going through this experience? How do you see the future?
Yeah, that's like a really burning question right now in the field. I made a film called The Rise of Psychedelic Capitalism, kind of exploring this. And I don't know. I mean, the first thing is that good psychedelic therapy involves a lot of therapy. So it involves a lot of time. It's potentially quite expensive. And it requires a lot of integration as well. So it's really, and holding people after the experience and giving them tools in order to actually apply it to their lives. There's the other problem of, which I know they've had a number of clinical trials, is that someone has a big opening experience, the depression lifts, but then they go back to their old life. And all the things that were making them depressed in the first place, again, Matrix, this idea of Betty Eisner's, starts to impact again. So there's an economist called Bennett Zellner who's actually in that film who talks about, well, what might it look like if we took that into account? And he has something called the pollination approach, which is that you make it a really grassroots thing. So you have it like in the town, like a small clinic in the town, but that it's linked to different services. It's like, okay, well, how do we actually, okay, this person's actually needs a job. They need their self-esteem raised, otherwise they're just going to be depressed again. So how do we connect them to that? How do we connect them to meaning and purpose in society? Maybe they need to get some exercise. So maybe there's some sports team we connect them to. And like, ideally the whole, we get kind of we come back to localized, community-focused holding and treatment, I think, away from the alienation, the atomization of sort of late capitalism. So that would be the ideal. That's what I would love to see. What I think is probably going to happen is that there's going to be many different expressions of it, some of which are quite corporate and corner cutting, some of which are really brilliant. This is the point Kat Kanor made in the film, who kind of focuses on psychedelic ethics and is a therapist. Like, some of them are going to be amazing. Some of them are going to be centers that are really changing people's lives. Some of them aren't. There's going to be problems and good things happening at the same time. There's going to be people taking psychedelics not in a clinical setting, as they always have been. And, you know, to be fair, there's more abuse in the underground than I think there'll ever be in the clinical space, because there's no accountability. There's psychedelic narcissists running around. There's people who have no idea about trauma, holding space for people. You know, it's a complete mess. So what I'd also like to see is that there's a cultural movement towards solidifying a kind of an ethics of the community as a whole. And that applies to where there's underground, it applies to clinics, it applies to other stuff. As I mentioned, like, the thing I'm most concerned about is psychedelic wellness, because it's what happened with mindfulness. The move from mindfulness from proper psychotechnology to watered down wellness pill really saddens me. And because I was partially involved in it, I was running a meditation school during that time, and stopped because of that reason. My wife and I both were running it and thought, like, this just doesn't feel right. You can't strip the spirit out of it. And I think that's something key, that we don't strip the spirit out of it. But just the final point, just to answer the question, I mean, from everything I've heard from people, I think it's likely that we will have it as a therapeutic option in the next 5 years in sort of countries that are leading the way in it. Will it be on the NHS? Probably, maybe not in 5 years. And I think it'll be a whole question of who gets access. That's a huge question, because if it's costing the NHS £30,000 to give someone proper psychedelic treatment, it can't be for everyone. So who gets it? Probably it'll start with the people who are the most unwell. Like a lot of, you know, some psychedelic research, one of the first studies was people with end-of-life anxiety. And that was because it was kind of easier to convince the FDA to, like, hey, these people are at the end of life anyway. Can we give them psilocybin to see if it reduces their end of life anxiety, which it does massively, which, you know, it's beautiful. So I think the sickest people first, a bit like the vaccine, actually, you know, it's probably maybe not an issue with that necessarily. And then we'll see 10 years down the road, you might be seeing billboards selling you LSD. It would have seemed unthinkable in the 80s, perhaps, looking towards now, cannabis industry. It seems kind of weird and unthinkable now, but it could well happen.
All right, thank you, Max. Do you have a hard stop at the top of the hour, Ali?
I can go another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So maybe we can sneak in 2 more questions. Okay. So we'll take in Aaron.
Hey, Alex. Great presentation. Thank you for doing this. I like asking difficult questions. So my question is, what are the dangers of promoting psychedelics in the sense-making space when many people are drawn to this space specifically because they are isolated, lonely, and in the grips of a meaning crisis? Or in other words, they lack a support system and the proper sovereignty to do this kind of experimentation alone.
Damn, Aaron. No, that's good. It's good to see you again. And that's a really important question. It's a really important question. I'm glad you asked it, because it's like, I think the word promoting, I mean, I should clarify again. I'm not promoting that people just go out and take psychedelics. You know, it's more a sense of that what helps us navigate the psychedelic space can be applied to sense making. But it's a very good point. You know, it's like this is a thing that comes up with psychedelics in general, which is that it attracts a lot of vulnerable people. You know, my experience of the sense making space has been not so similar to what I've seen in like new age psychedelic ceremony spaces. I think there's a lot more vulnerable people in those spaces. But I think what it comes down to is education. Like, there has to be a lot of context and psychoeducation around psychedelics wherever they're introduced, particularly in the sense making space. Because also, I would hate the idea that people take psychedelics because they want to be like uber sense makers, because it's not necessarily what happens. Like, often psychedelics can be just as can push us into like conspirituality and like totally having crap discernment, as much as they can push us into having more discernment and being more aware. And so, there's that famous phrase, to fathom hell or soar angelic, you need just take a pinch of psychedelic. It's both. It's always been both. And that's something that is being kind of not buried, but conveniently ignored as we move towards medicalization and sort of mainstream approval. Everyone is so desperate to show the good side and so desperate to see psychedelics as a panacea that's just going to cure everything, that we forget the dark side, because it's like kind of like when you first start going out with someone, it's like, oh, like rosy, everything's amazing. But we will start to see, and this is a point actually Eric Davis makes really well, like just like we have with mindfulness and other things, that they're not just harmless and they're not just going to solve all the problems. And I think Bennett Zellner's work that I mentioned earlier is such a wonderful example of that. It's like, great, give someone a psychedelic. Oh my God, the depression's lifted. That's beautiful. It's amazing. And it's beautiful. Like they're feeling better. And they might have been depressed for 20 years. And then they go home. And then the question you have to ask is, what kind of society we want to have? What kind of matrix do we want around people? And so there's many different layers to it. But I think my main point is tripping safely, tripping with a lot of research and education, not promoting anything legal either, I should make clear. And so there's a certain level of individual agency, of course, that comes into it. Adults are going to choose what they do. So there's that kind of complexity altogether.
Any quick follow-up, Aaron?
No, that's great. Thanks, Alex. Good to see you again too.
Cool. Jade, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you, Max. I didn't imply that at all. I just was hoping for some inclusivity of voices to this conversation, which more diversity always makes things more interesting. I had a really broad question. Obviously, we're in the midst of a climate and ecological crisis. My personal take is that the society and the culture that we're in is almost like a depressed person. Our culture is this Western psyche that's wrapped up in this ruminating thought pattern that is just a negative feedback loop. And something that I'm really passionate about is inquiring into how psychedelics on a collective level can help us break out of that negative feedback and into a positive feedback loop, like we've seen in some of the scientific literature about how psychedelics can address, anxiety and depression in people, and what you've mentioned in your presentation. So yeah, I just really value your opinion on how you think psychedelics can be related to helping us find some sort of deeper hope within the crisis that we see ourselves in.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, I love that idea of society being kind of ruminating and kind of in that that reciprocal narrowing that Rebecca talks about, that resonates for me. And I think there's a few different things. I think there's something around, what immediately springs up for me is like the reintroduction of ritual and the reintroduction of initiation, because that gives us meaning and purpose and that can have such a powerful effect on shifting us from one state of being to another. I think it for me at least, has this kind of psychic permission that I have with ritual. If I go, okay, this is my old life and I'm stepping into my new life. And so there's something around the initiatory process of psychedelics, and there's something around as well the nature connectedness that doesn't always, but can be enhanced with psychedelics. Because one thing that I always am curious about is, with this kind of proliferation of new religions, which are kind of wrapped in ideology and messy and decentralized and often more like a simulation of religion, they're kind of lacking the core transformative aspect of it. And in a post-truth world where everything is multiple narratives, how on earth are we going to find something that we all agree on is the good, the true, and the beautiful, and we can kind of connect with? And what I keep coming back to is nature. It is being connected and knowing that you are nature. And so nature connectedness is an area that my friend Sam Gandhi is really put a lot of work into, the relationship between nature connectedness and psychedelics. And I think there's something in that. There's something about coming into nature and having a shared experience, shared ritualized experience of being connected to the natural world. It's a huge part of my psychedelic experiences. And then that, I think, can cure at least some of what ails us. You know, there's the being in awe, you know, so part of it, I think, is because that rumination and that kind of constant like neurotic rumination of the Western mind is very, very narcissistic, and it's all about us, and it's all about how, you know, what are we going to do? And nature just blows it out of the water, and you kind of get a bit of a smile of like, it's just, yeah, let's stop being so self-centered and let's come back into the kind of into our ecological niche, let's say, and kind of ground ourselves in nature. Like that's what comes up for me immediately as something I would love to see, and that I feel in my heart is where I'd like to move to.
Any follow-up, Jade?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I agree with that. I'd probably also add, like, I feel like in my own experiences, it's such a humbling thing to realize your own insignificance in the grand scheme of things. And, you know, to me, a lot of the Western psyche is so centered around our self-centeredness, our belief that we're somehow separate to nature, that we're not affected. Even in this pandemic, there seems to be this stubborn belief that we're not affected by the natural world because we're somehow superior because we have science. And so, yeah, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jade.
All right, so we're at the top of the hour now, so let's close out here. Amazing presentation, Ali. I quite enjoyed that. Do you have any closing thoughts for us before we close up for the day?
No, I just want to say thank you, and that this is an ongoing process that I'm trying to kind of, I don't quite know what I'd like to create out of it, but I'd love to there to be some kind of resource that these tools can, we can use these tools for regular sense making. So if you have anything that's come up for you, you haven't had time to share or ask about, please just drop me a line. That would be, and what I really love is like anything that you think, actually, there's another element that you missed, that there's another aspect to it that, you know, because that is really, really valuable. And I would love to hear that and kind of crowdsource it a bit. So yeah, hope you found it useful. Glad you all came. Thank you. And yeah, look forward to seeing you soon. Beautiful. And thanks, Peter.
Beautiful. We'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Ali, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa. I see a lot of potential with this sense-making psychedelic thing. And it's just like a course or just some kind of like onboarding system that sets the frame before you go in. It's just be tremendously helpful. It's actually encouraging me to engage more in psychedelics myself. So to plug upcoming events, we actually, do you want to talk about the one we were having Friday, the Rebel Wisdom Clubhouse one? Or are you?
Yeah. Let's. I think the title. You should probably tell people the title because the title's awesome.
Fuller came up with this: Clubhouse, Social Revolution or Clout Chasing Wasteland with Rebel Wisdom.
Yeah, so I guess we're going to be basically looking at Clubhouse as a which of those things is it? You know, like Peter, you and I have talked about like the potential for audio only as a kind of really to be able to practice dialogos in a different way and bring all of these practices to a wider audience, especially because there is a lot of clout chasing on Clubhouse. Like some of it is like really cringy LinkedIn style and like networky stuff that is that I would love to shake up a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of good conversations to have there. And so we're going to have that at, 2 p.m. Eastern time. And then we're going to have a post event on Clubhouse, Sensemaking at Rebel Wisdom Stoa event. So that should be fun. And Aaron, do you want to plug your shadow event for tomorrow?
It's Wednesday, actually. But the Shadow Play Speaker Series is going to continue on Wednesday. We have Lisa Marciano of This Jungian Life podcast, and she's going to come talk to us about motherhood and the shadow that must be confronted in that journey. So please come Wednesday, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Hope to see you there.
And I highly recommend Aaron and Alyssa's Shadow Play series. I got so much freaking events at the store. I don't even know what's going on, but we have another one apparently tonight, another sense making and resonance series, 6 p.m. Eastern time. Howard Bloom is coming in. Everything you know about nature is wrong, the case of blooming cosmos. So you can check that out. Everything can be RSVP'd on thestoa.ca. So Ali, everyone, thank you for coming to the Stoa.